we continue to train graduate students, particularly PhD students, for taking academic jobs. And there are so few academic jobs, but we still keep training, turning out those PhDs, and they haven't got a prayer of finding work unless they do a whole lot of retraining on their own. That to me is unethical. That has to stop.
Welcome to UnLivable Cultures. UnLivable Cultures is a podcast making with and borrowing from anthropology, social theory, and other forms of knowledge for a more livable world. My name is Cody Scahan. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm joined by my co-hosts.
Julia Coverdale, and I use they, them pronouns.
And my name is Clayton Gerard. I use he, him pronouns as well.
Our guest today is Elizabeth K. Briody, who has been involved in cultural change efforts for over 35 years. This occurred first at General Motors and later through her consulting practice, Cultural Keys. Her projects have spanned many industries, including the automotive industry, healthcare, research institutions, aerospace, insurance, consumer products, and petrochemicals. Among her many books are The Cultural Dimension of Global Business and Transforming Culture. She leads the Anthropology Career Readiness Network, which can be found at anthrocareerready.net to improve student preparation for careers. She is the past president of NAPA, the National Association for Practicing Anthropologists, and served as the AAA, American Anthropology Association Secretary. In 2020, Briody was honored by the Society for Applied Anthropology with their Bronislaw Malinowski Award for Lifetime Achievement.
Thank you so much for coming on to the episode. And in this episode, we'll be talking about, just sort of how anthropology can be used in the applied world or the so-called real world outside of academia. Is there any specific question that either of you want to start out with?
One of my questions is, what has been some of your journey throughout anthropology and bringing it to the applied setting?
The work that I do is uses my anthropological skills. It happens to use them in organizational settings rather than in community settings per se. I have been doing this kind of work since 1985, and I love it. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much. That was really good. So looking at how you talked about organizations and organizational culture, how does that build on what we traditionally think of in anthropology of just like cultures being different people groups or different ways of social organizing?
Well, because I've had the opportunity to work in so many different kinds of organizations, it became pretty clear to me that organizations act in their own unique ways, much like community groups or subcultures would act in their own unique ways. And so you use the same methods or you invent methods that make sense in that cultural environment. You talk to people. I think one of the key differences between doing community work and doing organizational work is often that in organizations, your research is looked at by a lot of people. It's examined thoroughly, it's critiqued. And the reason for that is because if the organization is going to be making changes based on what you are recommending or what you and your internal colleagues are recommending, they want to be sure that the basis for those recommendations is as accurate and comprehensive as possible. And so a typical way in which that happens is the anthropologist does a piece of research for an organization and then presents the results and proposed recommendations back to the organizational leaders. And in that sense, there is a good, solid discussion back and forth with the researcher to try to understand what is it that the researcher discovered and is it credible based on the data that was collected. And then if those leaders are satisfied, then it makes sense to consider these proposed recommendations.
For those who may not be so familiar with the background of anthropology and traditional ethnography and how anthropology works, anthropologists would go into the field, do their research, come back, and then publish something. And then they wouldn't have a conversation with the people they were writing about really at all. There was tiny chance that it would actually get back to the original community. And sometimes when it did, though, it would have oftentimes negative effects. And that was more, that was even further along as anthropology developed, that the original culture or context would actually have access to this information. And so it's kind of like opens up a lot of questions of like, what is the value of doing this work for the community? Because they're not getting anything out of it there. It's just the researcher coming here, like learning, coming back, writing something, and then publishing it, making money and whatever, getting credit. Sounds like, at least in this context, there is some sort of more of a mutual sort of benefit of applied or organizational anthropology in this case.
Yeah, that has been my experience, at least. When you're presenting to a group of senior leaders in whatever kind of organization it is, could be a nonprofit, could be a government agency, could be a private sector firm. Those people are listening very intently to what you have to say. And at each step along the presentation, each section of the presentation, they are really looking to try to understand how you did the work, what you found, and what you think could be done to make things better, either for the employees or other stakeholders, help make the company more effective, help improve relationships, typically across organizational boundaries, such as different functions, different work groups, and so on.
So if you don't mind a follow-up question, was there much of a learning curve from being more classically trained in anthropology to going into these organizational settings?
The learning curve that I had to go through, and that many people who leave academia to practice have to go through, is that the full extent of the theory practice continuum is not taught typically in graduate school, at least not in anthropology. So you learn an awful lot about theory in graduate school. You learn nothing about practice. And practice is really all about problem solving. A group, a client, an organization has some issue or set of issues, and it needs to find solutions. And typically graduate students are not taught how to help the client. They are not taught to think in terms of solving practical problems. What's strange to me is that many in academia don't see the relevance of understanding the practice side. They understand the theoretical side. And interestingly, practitioners or practitioner scholars like I am, we understand the basic theory. We understand the methods. We also understand the practice. And so we get the whole thing, and you need the whole thing in order to make sense of whatever the issues are that you're trying to address. If you are coming right out of graduate school, you typically don't have that kind of focused learning that's so important if you're going to be able to help organizations make things better.
I think we're right back to my question about, is academia the real world? Does theory have this sort of effect or relationship with the real world? And I guess maybe a way of approaching this is like, what is the role of theory and your knowledge of theory in your own work?
Yeah, I use theory quite a bit in my own work, but it is not a single theory. Oftentimes you see that people in academia are particularly tied to a particular theoretical framework or a particular way of understanding the world. And that can be a starting point, but it's typically not going to be sufficient to help you put in place a framework to help a client, and then a set of ideas that that client can pick from as options for how to address the issue. So typically, an anthropologist who's working in practice has to draw from multiple theories in order to help the client sufficiently.
I appreciate you mentioning that. I currently work in more of an applied research capacity, even though I only received an undergraduate degree in anthropology. This was kind of the seemingly best option, graduating in the midst of COVID to get a more stable job instead of going straight into grad school. But it has been really surprising to see the difference between like people joining the organization from the typical workforce of more like company-driven areas, and then the people that are joining from academic spaces. And it's really perplexing, honestly, to see those first, few weeks between both sides, where one is trying to grasp what the research basis is, and the other is trying to grasp the like practical basis of work. And, kind of as you mentioned, you can't just go to the client at the end of your research and be like, well, I don't have anything in particular to say that should be done, but it brought up some really interesting questions. Like that's not something that you could really get away with. So I appreciate you speaking to that and thinking about how both the academic training and theory, and as well the more almost customer-oriented, practical side of things go together in your work.
And
Yes.
Clayton, I like how you said like the academic or the person coming from academia is figuring out how to work. Because like, I feel like it's accurate though. It's funny because it's like, personally in grad school right now, like we're not learning how to do a job, how to work. We're just reading stuff, and we're learning a little bit how to write, but it's mostly how to write something very specific. Like the writing course I just took is basically how to write a thesis proposal. Now I'm just writing my thesis. So I never had any classes of like, this is how you work. This is how you apply your skills to the real world or any kind. It's just, here's some ideas. Here's some stuff that people has written. Now write your own thing. And then I have my degree. So
one other question that I would love to ask, in your 2020 Bronislaw Malinowski Award address, Driving Organizational Change, you mentioned how you saw your involvement on the executive board of the AAA, the American Anthropological Association, to, quote, broaden the focus of anthropological work from do no harm to actually do some good. Would you mind elaborating on some of those ways that, you are using your anthropological experience to actually do some good?
Well, I think the number one problem today for universities training students in anthropology is that they are not looking beyond their walls. They are getting students through their programs, sometimes slowly, and here I'm speaking especially of graduate students. More importantly, they are not in a position to get students ready for the workforce, for whatever kind of job that student would end up doing. And because I feel so strongly about employment for anthropologists who use their skills and knowledge to make a difference in the world by helping organizations, I felt like it was important to start the Anthropology Career Readiness Network. So we started that 2 years ago in May, and our goal was to make sure that we could help both the instructors and the students. So we have really two different audiences, and we are in the process of building resources for both of those groups so that each can benefit. The instructors can learn how they can infuse practice into their existing courses, and the students can use, let's say, the tools that we've created to help them get themselves ready for the workforce.
in terms of the desire to like do good and have an impact, I can imagine some people making the criticism. For example, you worked in the automotive industry for a while, working in sort of maybe capitalist corporations, and especially, how capitalism and these sort of systems are generally talked about in anthropology circles. going into sort of automotive corporations, these giant, massive corporations that are making tons of money and doing all these things. How do you kind of square that desire to do good and impart good upon the world by using anthropology while working for automotive manufacturers or like a petrochemical company or something like that?
I think there's a hidden assumption in your question, which is that somehow organizations are bad.
Well, yeah, I guess that's what I'm trying to like unravel. Like,
I don't think of them as bad. I mean, if you walked into a community setting and thought that that community was bad, you wouldn't be much of an anthropologist. So when you go into any setting where you're going to do research, you have to be neutral. You have to try to be as objective as possible, or else you're not going to get good data. So you may have a preconceived notion of this group or that group, this organization or that organization. But the fact of the matter is that there are people inside that organization. There are people that work with that organization. And those organizations, yes, they generate money, but they also pay people. Oftentimes I've gotten this question about how could I possibly work. In fact, it happened relatively recently, and the question was framed something like, how could you possibly have worked for so many years at General Motors? And I asked why. Why was that? Why did the person think of that as a problem? The person couldn't articulate why it was a problem. But I know that there is this attitude out there, among anthropologists especially, that somehow if you work for a corporation, you are acting unethically. And in fact, I've been told that I am unethical, or at least I was unethical when I worked for General Motors. Well, I reject that completely. And my initial thought as a way to respond is to ask the person, can you tell me where your parents worked while you were growing up? And chances are those parents worked in a private sector corporation, or at least had some kind of a connection with a private sector corporation. So organizations can improve lives. I mean, in the US alone, I think I wrote in the Malinowski speech, there are like 7.5 million of them. And that probably is a conservative estimate. Organizations are part of our culture, period. If we know nothing about those organizations, and we don't know much because anthropologists have not been studying them in the numbers that they merit being studied, then we're missing out on so much. And we come away thinking we know what those corporations are like. And in fact, they don't.
Right. That was, to be honest, that was a bit of a loaded question, having read the Malinowski address. And then also recently, I've read Mary Douglas's How Institutions Think, and the way she kind of contextualizes and talks about, I mean, all institutions, organizations are fundamentally made up of people. Based on what I've seen about your work and other people working in practice, is to improve the conditions for the people working there when it comes to communication, when it comes to just workplace culture and just like how well they work together. So it's about looking after the person and their life at work rather than just to sort of make the corporation more efficient and just to focus on that aspect of things too.
Yeah, I mean, we do a lot of different kinds of work in organizations, and one big part of it is focused on relationships. And trying to improve relationships so that work gets done, and work gets done effectively. I'm not necessarily saying efficiently, but I am saying effectively, so that at the end of the day, when you go home, you feel like you've made a contribution. So that is an important part of what anthropologists do inside organizations. But they do so much more. I mean, they're helping make changes in what the products are and what the experiences or the services are that organizations offer. So they're trying to make things better for somebody or some set of somebodies.
I appreciate you speaking to that, because that's something as I mentioned before, I do work more in applied settings, and it's taken a little bit of like personal work trying to grapple with some of that stuff coming from an anthropology degree in undergrad, where there is a lot more of the attitude of like, all corporations are bad, all like government entities are bad, we need to be focusing on these other things. Whereas now I work pretty closely with different state government entities, and I'm like, it may have some questionable long-term results 50 years from now, but some of the stuff that we're doing is actually making a difference in people's lives today, and it is really important. So I do appreciate that you spoke to that.
Yeah, and I do think that anthropology needs a mindset change. I think that it really doesn't know what it's talking about when it starts blaming organizations, because there are very few people that have had experience inside them. They see them from the outside and they think that they know how those organizations function, when in fact they don't. And they will often try to use their theories to try to explain what they perceive is going on. So it's just not appropriate. The anthropology has a lot to offer, but one of its key concepts is the idea of holism. If you are only looking at organizations from the outside, rather than from both the outside and the inside, how can you possibly be able to describe and explain the behavior that goes on? You can't, because you have a partial view. So I think anthropology really needs to refocus how it thinks about the world outside of a university. How is it that people put bread on the table? What kinds of work might anthropologists contribute to? And start inserting elements of practice into their courses that can help students prepare. In my view, right now, there is a huge ethical issue in anthropology and in some of the other related fields. We continue to train graduate students, particularly PhD students, for taking academic jobs. And there are so few academic jobs, but we still keep training, turning out those PhDs, and they haven't got a prayer of finding work unless they do a whole lot of retraining on their own. That to me is unethical. That has to stop. And until universities realize that their incentive system is forcing instructors to stick with basic theory to the exclusion of practice, they will continue to turn out those PhD students who have nowhere to go, master's students who have nowhere to go, undergraduate students who have nowhere to go. And that is not appropriate in my view.
Especially naming it as unethical. That's a powerful way of characterizing it, but I totally agree. Because at that point, you're basically just exploiting people and having them, be like graduate TAs or just, in student debt and so on and so forth, without actually preparing them to do something with their degree, or at least something that they have a chance for, unlike academic positions in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and there are taboos against talking about jobs outside of academia. So if you're a graduate student at one of the flagship universities, you don't talk to your professor about options in government, options in nonprofits, options in private sector. You just don't, because you're not allowed to. It's ridiculous. We all need to work, and anthropology has so much it can offer to organizations. It can help us grow and change in ways personally and professionally, and you're well paid for it.
Makes a big difference.
Right. And there's one other analogy that I think is worthwhile to talk about here or to raise here, and that is that if you were a medical doctor and decided you wanted to go into research, clinical research, sure, you have to publish, just like anthropologists have to publish. You've got to get papers into good journals and so on. Okay, fine. But there is a point to all of that. You are trying to get to treatments. What good would it be if I go to the doctor and say, Doctor, I think I might have cancer. Cancer runs in my family. I don't feel good. And the doctor says, sorry, I'm just doing studies of that. I can't help you with treatment. That would be the silliest thing you ever heard. So we have an ability in some fields to go from theory to practice, but we don't have that ability in anthropology. At least it's not widespread. Those of us who are practitioners or practitioner scholars, yes, we do it. So why isn't anthropology changing? What more evidence do they need? Enrollment is down, at least in the United States, by 20%, and in some places 25%. And this is just in the last 10 years. You have increasing numbers of the so-called contingent faculty. These are faculty members, or I should say they're instructors, who do not have full-time positions. Well, in part, that's because enrollment is down, and in part, it's because universities are facing a lot of financial pressures. So I think that it behooves all of us to really reconsider the theory-practice continuum and to make changes. And they don't have to be massive, but they do have to change how we talk about anthropology and jobs, how we train students to be ready for whatever workplace they want to work in. And really, that's what the Anthropology Career Readiness Network is all about.
Julia, as someone who's about to start graduate school, do you have any reactions or feelings or questions?
I have more so questions. So I'm coming from like the archaeological perspective. So I'm interested, as somebody who's obviously just about to go into grad school, if these observations of anthropology and of training of both undergraduate and graduate students kind of similar in all of the subdisciplines within for-field anthropology, or if there's kind of varying degrees within cultural or archaeological, because I know that the archaeological job market is a little bit different than some of the other job markets.
That's correct. And many archaeologists will find their way into museum settings, for example, and some will find their way into cultural resource management firms. The problem, however, in archaeology is that the professors are not always willing to teach the necessary courses and techniques and skills that you need to acquire to be competent enough to work in a CRM firm after you graduate with whatever degree you've got. And because of that unwillingness in the US, because due to the passage of the Infrastructure Act under the Biden administration, there will be 24,000 open CRM jobs in the US and no one to fill them. So again, it's a problem. CRM is practice. CRM represents organizations. My feeling is, what's the problem here? Why aren't you training all of your students in basic practical techniques so that those who want to do that kind of work can do it, and those who opt to continue in academia and become a professor have a shot at doing it as well, but now actually have some training in CRM. So it's a huge problem in archaeology. The same is true in linguistic anthropology, and the same is true in forensic anthropology. So it's across the board.
So going off of that, I would love to ask, you've had some pretty significant roles in more of the structure of the discipline in anthropology, being a secretary of the American Anthropological Association. And I know you've also been involved in the Society for Applied Anthropology. What has your experience been like at more of a structural level, trying to have these conversations?
Well, in one case, I worked with a couple of other people at the request of the AAA president at the time to restructure how AAA organizational entities work together. There are these things called committees, various kinds of committees that the AAA has, And there were so many of them. They were just kind of all over the place. And the AAA president felt there wasn't a strong enough connection between the staff members that the AAA hires and these committees. And as a result, the committee work was often not going anywhere. And so they asked me to take the lead and work with a couple of other people and reorganize how the committee structure. And we did. And we gave some very explicit ideas for how the structure should be and how the work should follow from the structure. And so that, I think, was a good thing that happened as a result of me being involved in the AAA at that time. Another thing that we did is that we brought attention to the fact that there was insufficient mentoring within the AAA. I wrote with a number of other people a big report on mentoring. I think it was in 2016 or so. And that report laid out at the time that there were only 5 out of 40 sections that offered mentoring at all. 5 out of 40. Now we have many more that are mentoring, and questions are asked of all the sections. They have to fill out an annual report on their section activities, and one of them is about mentoring. So just by being asked, what are you doing? It raises the stakes for you. Like, oh my God, should we be doing something? Oh, well, we better, what do? We better do something because we're going to get asked that question. And so now many more of the sections actually run mentoring programs of some type.
That's awesome.
Those are 2 examples of how by participating actively in committee structures within the AAA, you can help to change an organization. I know one of your questions was on, how do you help change an organization? Well, by working on the inside.
Yeah, that's exactly. Really awesome.
Oh. Yeah, I was just going to say earlier, once again, I'm just reminded of Mary Douglas's How Institutions Think, which I think, honestly, this would be great to have as required reading for grad school programs, because I feel like if any book is attempting to actually bridge the theory practice divide, that would be potentially palatable to some professors of graduate programs. This would be the kind of book, because it does talk about the nature of organizations is to be conservative, not change much. And to actually alter them, you have to be a part of them. You have to actually take on some of the responsibility yourselves to institute these programs that you want to get across.
I think it does change your worldview of organizations when you are working directly with the people who are part of that particular organization. I'm reminded of the time when I worked at General Motors, and then it wasn't quite clear what would be the best way to power vehicles. And some of my colleagues who worked with me at research were working on hydrogen storage, and others were working on batteries. And nobody knew which of those 2 technologies would ultimately be the winner, if there is such a thing. Now we're much more likely to be thinking in terms of batteries, but even batteries have problems in the sense that you have to find the raw materials, right? You have to have access to cobalt and to lithium and to palladium and a bunch of other minerals. When you are talking with the researchers inside those companies, they're not telling you nonsense. They're telling you what's really going on. What the real constraints are. Oftentimes what you learn from a researcher is very different from what you read about in some blog post or news article or whatever. And it's because you are getting it right from the horse's mouth. And you see that it's not that people don't want to change the gasoline engine. It's that there are incredibly difficult obstacles to overcome in order to get us closer to green, whatever that means.
And not to mention the ethical conundrums with cobalt mining and rare earth metal mining, because a lot of it takes place in Africa and is super based on colonial systems of power and everything. So it's
how do you navigate that? If you can even try it.
Yeah, I have. Well, one of my friends, she works for the Prime Minister's office, doing climate change and sustainability in the organization. And just talking to her, and she was saying herself when she was super young, she was involved heavily in environmental activism, was vegan and very much the sort of call out sort of activist. But then now she works for the Prime Ministry and she sees the people that are involved in these projects, and she understands in a lot of cases they are trying, but their hands are tied in a lot of things, what they can and can't do, which is definitely something that I think anthropologists don't always take into account when we're criticizing these sort of organizations. And not to say that we shouldn't criticize them and we shouldn't, seek to change them, but there's perhaps more informed and tactical ways of doing it if you want to actually change something rather than just in science and technology studies, which is closely associated with anthropology and the work, for example, through the work of Bruno Latour and other anthropologists. What's interesting to me is that reading their work, you get actor network theory, you get general ideas about how people within organizations may work together or don't work together, how respond to one another, things like this. But in at least of what I've read from these sort of theorists, you don't get so much, and this is probably also partly of who he's working with, because he's working with, oftentimes academic research scientists or groups like this. You don't get the sense of how their relationship to their work is, and kind of what we're talking about right now of what they're trying to, their sort of overall objectives, their meanings, their worldviews, and how that drives their work.
Interdisciplinary matters, working with people who don't do the same kind of work that you do matters. Having a different perspective on things. That's why I think it's really valuable to have multiple kinds of people working together on projects. And that's another issue for anthropology. Anthropology is the lone wolf discipline. Off you go to do your field work all by yourself. Well, okay, first of all, you haven't been trained. So you haven't got a clue. You have to learn it on your own. And how many of us have had to learn it on their own? Way too many. Why is it that we are not accompanying instructors directly into the field? Okay, so that's a big problem. Second problem and related problem is that anthropology does not consider collaboration, internal collaboration among themselves, to be very important. It has to be pushed in that direction by organizations like the National Science Foundation in the US or other places that now require that you are working with other people. So we do not do what, let's say, the business schools do, which is get the entire group in the class to work on a project together. Class projects are very rare in anthropology, and it's something that people in the network are pushing very, very hard. Just working on a term paper together, that's unusual in anthropology. Why is that? Why would it need to be that way? It doesn't. It doesn't have to be that way. You have to be able, what you ideally would like is to have the training you get in school mimic what you're going to find in the workforce. So if you are trained to be the lone wolf, how far is that going to help you when you get to the workforce? It's not going to help you at all. You need to be able to sort it out, figure out who's doing what your timetable is, whether you need any resources and how you're going to get them, and then do the darn project and get it in. And you have to be able to manage the personalities, manage the illnesses, manage whatever you have to manage in order to make sure that you deliver your product. And we are not training students to do that. So how is that helpful? So there are just so many ways in which anthropology could be different, collaboration being one of those ways, that would help students prepare to enter the workforce in a way that would give them a leg up instead of a leg down.
Yeah, thank you for speaking to that. And going along these same lines of training students, anthropology students from undergrad or graduate programs, there has been a lot of talk recently about student debt relief and different programs to kind of keep college costs in check. I think one is the Lowering Education Costs and Debt Act that's going to be brought to the Senate. The Biden administration has also tried to enact some things through the Department of Education. A lot of these have requirements for people that graduate from these departments and programs to have, the salary or whatever else to be able to pay for the costs that they'll incur by studying these programs. Do you think those kinds of potential policies being implemented, do you think that could impact the discipline of anthropology and similar social sciences? Do you think that could help people rethink the ways that we're teaching and training people to become anthropologists and what anthropology is valuable for?
Yes, I think it's already happening. It's happening, I know of, in at least 2 states, in California and in Arizona, where there are now requirements by the legislatures for knowing what exactly are the students being trained to do. So having elements of practice as part of the curriculum and as part of the overall program, so that you get students thinking about where they're headed. It's not just graduation day, end of story. Graduation is an important ritual and important to recognize, but what comes after it? So, you always want to have your eye on the future that's a bit further out. And even once you get into the workforce, you're going to end up probably in multiple jobs over the course of your career. Okay, so how do you manage those transitions? If we had a little bit more emphasis while in school on those kinds of things, that would be extremely helpful to students. Just the idea of looking forward. I was involved in one class project with a group of students who were interviewing their peers. These were all anthropology students. And the students found that their peers weren't thinking beyond like the next semester. It was crazy. Like, well, why are you in this major then? And in part, that's up to the instructors. The instructors have to help the students think through, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? What's it good for? What will you do with it? All these kinds of questions. It's not just knowledge for knowledge's sake. It's knowledge with a purpose. And there could be multiple purposes, but it is knowledge with a purpose.
Yeah, I appreciate that. One of the most impactful classes that I had during undergrad was we had an initiation to anthropology course. And one class period, the professor literally took us through what looking for a job on LinkedIn or Indeed.com is like. And he was like, if you're studying anthropology, what are you going to find that could be associated with anthropology? And he's like, look up research, look up ethnography, look up social science, et cetera, et cetera. And that's actually how I found this job. Is I went on Indeed and looked up social science. And then, the job title popped up and I applied for it and, kind of went on from there. But even looking back, that was one of the most impactful things from undergrad.
I was just thinking though, too, like for me too, I mean, in taking that course and before it, I was like, I just studied anthropology because I enjoyed it. And like, I enjoyed learning about it, and which in and of itself, not always necessarily a problem, but it becomes the problem when your introduction to cultural anthropology teacher converts you to anthropology and doesn't tell you what you're going to do with it afterwards, or says, oh, you're just going to do academia, or you're just going to just learn it because it's interesting, because it's fun, because it, like some people talk about anthropology as just being a good sort of set of life skills to have. And it definitely has, changed the way I see the world and has helped me in some ways just navigate life generally. But that doesn't always equate to getting a job or having a successful career or anything like that. And I would say grad schools, in my experience, just as a master's student, it's the same. Like it's almost worse, in fact, in terms of, not giving you recommendations. And there's a strong sense from me and just everyone else that like, hey, we just want to be students forever because it's kind of like cushy. But like once we get into the real world, it's just like this sort of black void of like scariness, and we don't know what to do once we get there. So we're just like, okay, maybe I'll just apply for some PhD programs. I'll just apply for another master's program, whatever, just to avoid this unknown thing that we don't know anything about, because what we are in right now is comfortable.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe for some people, but if you don't have that much money and you have to pay for school on your own, it can be extremely challenging, because then you have all this debt once you get out of school. So it's tricky. But I guess what I would say,
but if you keep studying,
then you don't have to pay it off.
I was just going to say that.
Then you'll
exactly.
Yeah, but eventually you're gonna.
It makes the problem worse.
Right. Many universities across the U.S., at least, and Canada to a certain extent, bringing in practitioners for an applied anthropology course, let's say, or a design anthropology course, or something of that type. That is extremely helpful, because it gives students an idea of what kinds of opportunities await them. Wouldn't it be great if when you went into Anthro 101, the very first day of class, they exposed you to a wide set of careers that you could do with an anthropology degree? Wouldn't that be cool? Certainly, we have a lot of information about the kinds of work practitioners have done, and somebody just needs to put it together. You show a photograph, this one does this one does that. She started here, he then went there, however you want to frame it up. But if you really got students' attention on day one, think of how that could then fuel the enrollment issue. But we don't do that.
I'll share one thing that might be exciting to you. That was actually done in my Intro to Anthropology class, Intro to Cultural Anthropology. And I think the main difference was because I took that course at a community college. So the professor knew that it was important to show students that there can be careers in anthropology, and this can be an actual field of study that does have, a livable wage tied to it. And before that class, I was going to be an English major. And then I took the class and I was like, oh, this changes everything. And when I had that conversation with my parents, I was like, because they didn't know what anthropology was. They were like, what do you do? Study ants or something? And I was like, no, you can actually do all these really cool things just by, studying cultures and studying social organization and practices and different things like that. So that's
ants, right? The social organization of ants.
Definitely. But so that was like really impactful for me to, even though I wasn't, interested in some of those routes, I was able to point to them, at least to my parents, and be like, this can be a valuable degree for me.
I think that's wonderful. And I do know that community colleges are very focused on employment. That's just the way that set of colleges is structured. It's part of their ideology. It's part of who they are. And I wish that carried through to a 4-year college and then beyond to graduate school. That would be great. To me, the solution is for anthropology to do both, to stick with the theory because theory matters, to teach the methods because those matter, and to teach practice. I don't understand why we can't have it all. We should have it all. We need it all. And even those who will end up in professor positions at some point will value what they learned in practice. all of the skills they acquired, their association with different kinds of workplaces and so on. I mean, that will end up being quite valuable to them and give them a way to ground what they're saying and understand it in relation to the theory. And will also enable them to see that theory building actually occurs in the workplace. It's not just the academics who create theory. There's a lot of value in working in a workplace. Not only can you create theory, but you can test existing theory. And then you can write up whatever articles you want to write up and say, hey, this is what I found.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for speaking to that. And I really appreciate the Anthropology Career Readiness Network's work on creating those resources and pathways to help students and also professors to ready themselves for not just the workplace, but also for enriching the discipline of anthropology. And
exactly.
Hopefully,
right now, anthropology is just too one-sided. And it needs to open its doors. It has always said to itself, we're so open-minded. We have this holistic perspective. We are not ethnocentric. Well, I question all three of those.
Yeah, especially after this conversation today, I'm starting to question some too, because, I think back to earlier when you said it's unethical to be churning out these degrees,
right,
and getting kids to have student loans and such, and then not preparing them for a way to actually, deal with them. So yeah, I definitely appreciate it and the way that you highlight the one-sidedness.
Yeah, it's just incomplete. We need an academic orientation to the world, but it's only partial. The rest of it is actively working in the world and then going back and forth between the worlds, right? And so I think somebody in my position who is able to maintain connections with academia and maintain connections with the world of work has the best of both worlds, because you are the broker between the two. You can understand each party's perspective, and you can serve as a bridge.
Isn't that like what anthropology is supposed to be about? Like, we think of ourselves as cultural, translators.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation and the important work that you're doing to make the business case. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for joining us.
Thank you too.